Significant announcement revealed last night. The government is to privatise Channel 4. The state-owned broadcaster receives no taxpayer funding, but it is reported that the government hopes the sale of this asset could bring in £1 billion to the Treasury. Well, let's dive straight into this story now with Mark Littlewood, who is the Director General at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the programme, Mark. This is a significant announcement from the government last night, something that institutes like yours have been recommending for quite some time. Just how would it work in practice?
It's pretty straightforward, Tom, and in my view, not before time. Channel 4 will be a commercial enterprise. It will be sold. You'll be able to buy shares in it. It will compete on a completely level playing field with all the many other television offerings out there, not least your own. I don't see why Channel 4 and GBNews should be in any sort of different position whatsoever. This is a legacy issue. I think Channel 4's been around for about just shy of 40 years now. I think it will meet its 40th anniversary in November of this year. But technology and television has moved on so enormously. I mean, I'm betraying my age here, Tom, but when I were a lad, there were only 3 television stations. I remember the excitement when I was 10 and Channel 4 came on. There was now the number 4 button on your remote control now delivered pictures. But it's preposterous for the government in this day and age to own TV stations, whether they're successful, and Channel 4 has been pretty successful. It's a sort of niche channel, but still pretty successful within its own remit. It's ridiculous. It's as absurd for the government to own television stations as it would be for them to own a chain of hotels or a restaurant or something like that. So let's set Channel 4 free. I think they will then find it easier to raise capital on the open market. They're not going to displace Amazon or Netflix, but those are the sort of giants of broadcasting that British companies now need to compete with. And this puts Channel 4 in a position where I think it will do a better job than if it was still controlled by the government or owned by the government.
Well, a number of people this morning, and it's potentially the usual types, have been out expressing outrage about the idea that the government might shed this public asset. Of course, there are some conditions attached to state ownership of Channel 4. For example, it has to provide that public service broadcasting. It has to not make a profit and reinvest any profit back into its own programming. Might that be at risk in the event that it is sold off?
Well, I certainly hope so. I haven't poured through all the details yet. I think this rather nebulous concept of public service broadcasting is for the birds, really. Again, because we've now got such a plethora of different broadcast options, not just on TV and radio. You open your show every morning, Tom, by saying coming to you on TV and radio. I often watch you on YouTube, right? There's so many different platforms, even for one particular news station. But I had occasion to look up earlier what Channel 4's public service remit is. It's incredibly vague. It needs to appeal to the tastes and interests of a culturally diverse society. It needs to demonstrate innovation, experimentation and creativity. It needs to exhibit a distinctive character. Well, you, Tom, exhibit a distinctive character, but I don't think there's any reason for you to be owned by the state. These are really, really nebulous things. If, and I don't particularly want this, but if you think there is a role for public funding to make particular programs, I don't know, let's say education programs for kids, for example, well, there's no need to tag that to a particular TV station anymore. That could be open to a bidding war. It could be, you could put these programs up on YouTube. It doesn't need to be on one particular number on your remote control. So I think public service broadcasting doesn't really make sense in the modern era. And if you want it, you don't need to tag it to a particular platform. You could open it up to the market and they could land that product anywhere. Channel 4 News, GB News, YouTube, the BBC, ITV, you name it. That would be a much more sensible way to proceed in future.
It is remarkable that this does seem to be potentially a political move from a government that has a large majority and has faced a lot of criticism from people that it's not particularly using its majority in a particularly conservative way. Of course, it's raised the tax burden. It's taken some rail franchises into state ownership. There's been a lot of criticism from the right that this government hasn't been living up to the Thatcherite promise that some expected at the time of the last election. This being a significant privatisation, this being something that's potentially more in that Thatcherite mould, although I do recognise the irony that Channel 4 was founded underneath the Thatcherite government, potentially this is a political signal as well as an economic move.
I think that's right, Tom. And you mentioned that Channel 4 might raise £1 billion if it's floated. I don't know whether it would raise that amount or maybe a bit more. Hardly going to revolutionise the public finances. I think what's interesting here, under the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, is this actually now a bit of a direction of travel? If you're reaching these conclusions about Channel 4, why would you not reach the same conclusions about the BBC? Now, that would be a radical, as you might term it, Thatcherite move. And I think it does start to take us in that direction. If the government and the Culture Secretary have reached the conclusion that Channel 4 should be set free and liberated from the dead hand of the state, you've got to wonder whether it's going to be too many weeks, months or years before the same conclusions reached about the BBC. Perhaps the licence fee will finally come to an end and the BBC will be free to compete in an open market on a subscription basis, I would imagine, or possibly even on a membership basis. So don't expect the sale of Channel 4 to cure the national debt or even the deficit. It's not going to make a big gain in the public finances, but as a signal, perhaps a political signal, but a signal about where the government's thinking on broadcast, well, I welcome it, because although Channel 4 is relatively small fry for all its success, perhaps it signals that reform of the BBC, which is decades overdue, could be coming next.
Well, it used to be the case in this country that telecommunications was owned by the state as well. There was a fervent debate when that was being privatised in the 1980s, and now that seems a little ridiculous that you'd have to get a phone through the mechanisms of the state. I wonder how ridiculous this conversation will seem in 10 or 20 years' time if this privatisation is successful. There was a time when the government owned all energy, even owning some pubs, owning utilities, owning just about every aspect of society. It's interesting to see that we may be moving further away from that, potentially in the Thatcherite mould. Still a lot to be seen on this question and definitely fervent debate to happen. But for now, Mark Littlewood, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing to discuss that important issue.